Muslims claim that Jesus was a Muslim, but when we turn to the best historical evidence about Jesus' life and teachings, we find plenty of reasons to conclude that Jesus was not a Muslim. Here are the top 10. Reason number 1, Jesus died on a cross. The Quran says that Jesus didn't die on a cross, but our best historical sources about Jesus say that Jesus did die on a cross. And even an agnostic historian like Bart Ehrman says, I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was physically crucified and died on the cross. That is rock bottom certain in my books, and it stands completely at odds with standard Islamic beliefs. The Muslim Jesus didn't die on a cross, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 2, Jesus taught his followers to call God Father. Father is not one of Islam's 99 names of God, and the Quran criticizes Christians for saying that they are the children of Allah. But our best historical sources about Jesus say otherwise. Jesus, when talking to his followers, repeatedly refers to God as your Father. For example, Matthew 6:6 says, But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. A Muslim Jesus wouldn't teach his followers to call God Father, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 3, Jesus calls himself the Son of God. The Quran criticizes Christians for calling Jesus the Son of God. It says, the Christians say, the Messiah is the Son of Allah. Such are their baseless assertions. But our best historical sources about Jesus say otherwise. In John 10:36, Jesus says, I am God's Son. And in Matthew 14:33, Jesus is worshipped and his disciples say, truly, you are the Son of God. A Muslim Jesus wouldn't call himself the Son of God, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 4, Jesus never mentioned the Kaaba and he never prayed towards Mecca. The Quran says that Allah has made the Kaaba, the sacred house, a sanctuary of well-being for all people. Surah 2:144 says, turn your face in prayer towards the sacred mosque in Mecca. Wherever you are, turn your faces toward it. But our best historical sources about Jesus don't say anything about the Kaaba and Mecca. Jesus never mentions a sacred house from the time of Abraham for all people and never turns his face to pray towards Mecca. Jesus never instructed his disciples to visit Mecca or face Mecca. There is no record of Jesus' followers doing this. A Muslim Jesus wouldn't ignore Islam's holiest places, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 5, Jesus didn't teach his disciples to fast during Ramadan. According to the Hadith, Muhammad said, whoever fasts Ramadan out of faith and hope of reward, his previous sins will be forgiven. But our best historical sources about Jesus say that while he did teach about fasting, he didn't teach anything about the month of Ramadan, or about only fasting during the day, or about the night of power, or about fasting securing the forgiveness of sins, or about everyone fasting together as a group. That's some pretty important stuff to forget. Rather, Jesus taught in Matthew 6:17-18 that Christians should not make it obvious when they are fasting. A Muslim Jesus would not ignore Islam's holiest month, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 6, Jesus prayed while looking upwards. Muslims love to point out, at least once, Jesus prayed facing down. And since Muslims pray facing down, Jesus must have been a Muslim. But in our best historical sources about Jesus, it says, after Jesus said this, he looked toward heaven and prayed, Father, the hour has come, glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. A Muslim Jesus wouldn't pray while looking upwards to heaven, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 7, Jesus expected his followers to read and know the scriptures. The Quran mentions previous books sent by God, including those given to Moses and to David, but doesn't show much interest in them. The Quran has no quotations from the Old Testament. The Quran never commands or even recommends that Muslims read the previous books. Muslims often allege that those books have been corrupted. But our best historical sources about Jesus show that he often introduced quotations from the Old Testament by saying, have you not read what God said to you? In other words, Jesus knew the previous books and expected his listeners to know them too. He amazed religious teachers with his knowledge of the scriptures and expected his listeners to know God's word. A Muslim Jesus wouldn't tell his listeners to read the previous scriptures, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 8, Jesus actually understood the previous scriptures. The Quran mentions previous books sent by God, but doesn't seem to know much about them. In Quran 22:36, Muslims are told to sacrifice and eat camels. The Quran says that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the sister of Aaron. But Jesus knew the law of Moses. Camels must not be sacrificed or eaten. And Jesus knew that Aaron lived over 1,000 years before his mother. While the Quran is clueless, our best historical sources for the life of Jesus show that he would converse with experts about the law of Moses and about the history of the Jewish nation. A Muslim Jesus, like the Quran, wouldn't know much about previous scriptures, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 9. Jesus allowed what Muhammad forbade. According to the Hadith, Muhammad taught that alcohol is completely forbidden. Not one single drop is allowed. But in our best historical sources about Jesus, he drank wine. It even provided wine for a wedding. Jesus taught his disciples to remember his death by drinking wine. The Bible consistently forbids drunkenness. But Jesus and all the prophets in the Bible before him did not forbid alcohol. A Muslim Jesus wouldn't allow the drinking of alcohol, but the real Jesus did. Reason number 10. Jesus forbade what Muhammad approved. According to the Quran, Muslims are permitted to have sex with their slaves. Quran 70:29-30 tells Muslims to guard their chastity except from their spouses or slave girls, for then they are free of blame. Quran 23:5-6, 424, and 33:50 say the same thing. Muslim history say that Muhammad used to visit Miriam and he had intercourse with her by virtue of her being his property. But our best historical sources about Jesus say that he had no sex slaves and didn't permit anyone else to have them either. Jesus affirmed that a husband and a wife become one flesh. What God has joined together, let no one separate. Jesus' followers taught that marriage should be honored by all and the marriage bed kept pure. A Muslim Jesus wouldn't have a problem with sex slaves, but the real Jesus did. How do we know what the real Jesus taught? It's contained in the 4 Gospels. Do you think I'm arguing in a circle? Not a chance. Check out these playlists on why the Gospels are historically reliable accounts of the life of Jesus.